In 1985, 4 men accidentally hijacked a cruise ship. That's not a joke. The hijacking was never supposed to happen. But once it did, it triggered a chain of events so chaotic that the United States and Italy nearly opened fire on each other. An innocent man was killed and thrown into the sea, and the mastermind escaped dressed in an airline uniform while the whole world was watching. Here's something that almost nobody talks about when they tell this story. The Achille Lauro hijacking, one of the most chaotic, politically explosive hostage situations in modern history, was never actually supposed to be a hijacking at all. The 4 men who took over that ship, they weren't there to take hostages. They weren't there to terrorize tourists. They had a completely different mission. And the only reason any of this happened, the only reason we're even talking about this today, is because of a fruit basket. We'll get to that. But first, let's go back to where this story really begins. Not on the water. In a room somewhere where a man named Mohammed Zaidan, better known to the world as Abu Abbas, was drawing up a plan 11 months in the making. Abu Abbas was the leader of a Palestinian splinter group called the Palestine Liberation Front, the PLF, a smaller, more radical faction, one that had already carried out a string of armed raids across Israel and the West Bank since the late 1970s. Abbas was ambitious, connected, and deeply resentful of what he saw as the weakening of the Palestinian resistance movement. By 1985, things had been going badly for the PLF. They'd been expelled from Damascus. There was vicious infighting in the Lebanese camps, and on October 1st, just 6 days before our story begins, the Israeli Air Force had bombed PLO headquarters in Tunis, killing 60 people. The pressure was immense. Something had to be done. Something bold. Something that would send a message nobody could ignore. So Abbas came up with a plan. His men would board an Italian cruise liner as regular passengers. When the ship docked at the Israeli port of Ashdod, they would disembark and open fire on Israeli soldiers. A mission designed to be a direct retaliation for the Tunis bombing. The ship he chose was the MS Achille Lauro. She left Genoa, Italy on October 3, 1985, carrying 748 passengers on an 11-day Mediterranean cruise. Inside that passenger list were people from across the world, retirees, couples celebrating anniversaries, families treating themselves to something special. Among them was a group of close friends from New York and New Jersey who had swapped their usual summer at the Jersey Shore for something a little more memorable. One couple in that group was Leon and Marilyn Klinghoffer. Leon was 69 years old. He had built a small appliance manufacturing business from the ground up. He had survived 2 strokes, which had left him reliant on a wheelchair to get around. This cruise was a celebration, Marilyn's 58th birthday and their 36th wedding anniversary. She had just beaten colon cancer into remission. After everything they had been through, they deserved this. They had no idea 4 men on the same ship were cleaning weapons in a locked cabin. On October 7th, the Achille Lauro docked in Alexandria, Egypt. This was a scheduled tourist stop. Passengers could disembark and take a bus tour to see the pyramids, then meet the ship again later at Port Said. 651 passengers took that offer. That left roughly 97 people still on board, mostly elderly. Mostly people who, like Leon, couldn't easily manage a long bus tour, and the 4 PLF operatives who stayed behind to wait. Here's where the fruit basket comes in. While the ship sat in Alexandria, a cabin steward was making his rounds, delivering complimentary fruit to the cabins, the kind of small courtesy that cruise ships are known for. He knocked on a cabin door. No answer. The door wasn't locked, so he pushed it open and walked in on 4 men trying to clean the gasoline residue off a set of weapons they'd smuggled on board, hidden inside a car's gas tank. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the 4 men panicked. The original plan, the careful 11-month plan to reach Ashdod, was blown. There was no recovering it. If that steward went to the captain, it was over. So they made a split-second decision that would rewrite history. They weren't going to Ashdod anymore. They were taking the ship right now. Within minutes, the Achille Lauro was sailing out of Alexandria, and somewhere on board, 4 armed men were about to introduce themselves to the 97 passengers who had no idea what was coming. Nobody on shore knew yet. The ship was just gone. The first thing most passengers heard was gunfire. Not outside, not distant. Right there in the dining room. Shots fired into the ceiling, the sound cracking through the air like the world had split open. People dove under tables. Others froze completely, convinced for a second that their brain was lying to them. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not on a cruise. But it was. The four men moved fast. They herded everyone into the ship's main lounge, weapons raised, voices loud and sharp, even through the language barrier. The message didn't need translation. Sit down. Don't move. The Achille Lauro, a floating holiday, a symbol of leisure and luxury, had just become a prison in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Captain Gerardo de Rosa was marched to the bridge. The demand was simple, at least on the surface. Contact the Israeli government. Tell them to release 50 Palestinian prisoners, including a man named Samir Kuntar. If the prisoners weren't freed, the hijackers would start killing hostages. They claimed to have 20 armed men on board. They had 4, but nobody in that lounge was about to start counting. Israel didn't respond, so the hijackers ordered De Rosa to sail northeast, to the Syrian port of Tartus. Syria was a logical choice. It was sympathetic territory, or so they thought. But when the Achille Lauro arrived off the coast of Tartus and the hijackers radioed their demands ashore, Syria's answer was immediate and absolute. No, you cannot dock here. Turn around. That was the first wall. They sailed toward Cyprus next. Same answer. The island wanted nothing to do with a hijacked ship, a hostage crisis, and the international firestorm that came with it. Denied again. Think about what this does to 4 men who are already running on adrenaline and desperation. They had no exit. No country was willing to give them a stage. The plan that had seemed so forceful, so decisive in the moment, was dissolving in real time. They were stuck on a ship going in circles, with a demand nobody was meeting and a deadline that meant nothing because nobody was listening. The tension on board was unbearable. The hijackers began moving through the lounge differently now, less commanding, more erratic. They started separating passengers by nationality. Americans in one group, British in another. At one point they threatened to kill the Americans, then the British. The threats kept shifting, which somehow made everything worse. An unpredictable captor is a far more terrifying thing than a consistent one. And then they started looking more carefully at individuals. The criteria, as far as anyone could tell, was simple and sickening. They were looking for someone Jewish, someone who couldn't fight back, someone whose death would make a statement loud enough to be heard from shore. Leon Klinghoffer was in his wheelchair near the edge of the group. He wasn't quiet about his anger. Survivors would later recall that Leon didn't cower, he argued. He pushed back verbally even from that chair, even surrounded by armed men. It was exactly the kind of defiance that, in any other situation, you'd call admirable. In this one, it made him a target. The hijackers had been refused by Syria, refused by Cyprus, ignored by Israel. And now, floating somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean with no leverage and no audience, they decided they were going to make one. Leon Klinghoffer didn't know what had just been decided. Neither did his wife. On October 8th, the hijackers took Leon Klinghoffer to the open deck. They shot him. Then they ordered the ship's barber and a waiter to throw his body overboard. His wheelchair went with him. Marilyn was told he had been taken to the infirmary. She spent hours asking about him, being brushed off with the same story. He's fine. He's resting. Stop asking. She had no reason yet to doubt it. The alternative was too unthinkable to consider on your own. So she waited, and the hijackers said nothing. Meanwhile, Abu Abbas, still on land, still pulling strings, managed to reach the ship through a Cypriot radio station, broadcasting a message under a fake name telling the hijackers to sail immediately to Port Said and treat the passengers kindly. The hijackers, who had been drifting with no plan since Cyprus turned them away, heard the broadcast and obeyed. The captain was ordered to change course. What followed on the morning of October 9th looked, on the surface, like a diplomatic success. Egyptian and Italian officials were involved. PLO chairman Yasser Arafat publicly condemned the hijacking and sent representatives to help broker the deal, one of whom was Abbas himself, somehow now positioned as a peacemaker despite being the man who planned the entire operation. The hijackers agreed to surrender. The hostages would be released. In exchange, the hijackers would receive safe passage out of Egypt to Tunisia. Everyone shook hands. The crisis appeared to be over. Passengers who had been held for nearly 2 days finally stepped off the ship. They were exhausted, shaken, desperate to call their families. But as people disembarked and started talking, fragments of a different story began surfacing. A waiter had been ordered to do something he refused to speak about at first, and one detail kept pushing its way through every conversation. Leon Klinghoffer had not been seen by anyone since October 8th. The ship's radio had not been as private as the hijackers assumed. A U.S. Navy RC-135 spy plane had been circling the region throughout the entire crisis, intercepting communications. American intelligence analysts had been listening the whole time, and what they heard, transmissions from the Achille Lauro boasting openly about throwing a body into the water, had already reached Washington. Now here's something most people don't realize about this story. From the very first hour the hijacking was reported, President Ronald Reagan had already deployed SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force on standby, quietly pre-positioning them for a potential rescue mission. Reagan was not a man known for letting things slide, and the idea of American citizens being held hostage on a ship in the Mediterranean while the world watched was not something he was prepared to accept. His teams had been shadowing the Achille Lauro the entire time, ready to move the moment the order came. The murder of an American citizen changed everything. Reagan's team was furious, not just at the hijackers, but at Egypt, who had already promised them safe passage and were now preparing to quietly fly them out of the country. The peaceful resolution the world was being asked to celebrate had been built on top of a murder that everyone involved was hoping would stay underwater, literally. There was exactly one window to act. The hijackers and Abu Abbas had already boarded an Egyptair Boeing 737 at Cairo. The plane took off at 4:15 in the afternoon on October 10th, destination Tunisia. Egypt had told neither the United States nor Italy. They had simply moved the men and assumed the world would let it go. Reagan looked at his options. Then he picked up the phone and gave the order. The F-14s were already in the air. 4 U.S. Navy F-14 Tomcats found the Egyptair 737 in international airspace south of Crete. It was night. The Egyptian pilots had no idea what was happening until the fighters appeared alongside them, close enough to see. A U.S. Navy E-2 Hawkeye command plane ordered the 737 by radio to follow the F-14S immediately. The Egyptian crew had no real choice. They followed. The plane was directed to Sigonella, a NATO airbase in Sicily, Italy. Italy had been informed minutes before landing, not hours, minutes, because Washington had deliberately kept Rome out of the loop, hoping to land the hijackers on Italian soil and immediately transfer them into American custody before anyone could object. It was an audacious plan. It almost worked. But Italian Prime Minister Bettino Craxi had other ideas. The moment the 737 touched down at Sigonella, SEAL Team 6 moved in, surrounding the aircraft on the tarmac. They had been waiting. They were ready. For about 30 seconds, it looked like the United States had pulled off one of the most remarkable counterterrorism operations in history. Then the Italian Carabinieri showed up, and the Italian Air Force, and they surrounded the SEALs. So now you had American Special Forces surrounding an Egyptian airliner, Italian military police surrounding the American Special Forces, and somewhere inside that plane, 4 hijackers and the man who sent them. Weapons were raised on both sides. Nobody fired, but nobody moved either. The standoff lasted 5 hours. Craxi reportedly called Reagan directly, his voice shaking, telling him he could not allow American forces to operate inside Italian jurisdiction. The ship was Italian. The crime happened on Italian territory. The trial would be Italian. That was not a negotiation. It was a statement. Reagan backed down. The 4 hijackers were handed to Italian authorities with an American guarantee that they would be prosecuted for murder, and they were, receiving sentences between 15 and 30 years in 1986. That part of justice, at least, was served. But Abu Abbas was a different problem entirely. He was also on that plane. Italian authorities briefly had him. The United States was frantically trying to file paperwork, arrest warrants, extradition requests, fast enough to keep him from walking out. They weren't fast enough. Abbas was released, slipped out of Rome's Fiumicino airport dressed in an Egyptair uniform, boarded a chartered Yugoslav plane, and disappeared. The Italian government collapsed shortly after over the scandal. Abbas spent the next 18 years as a ghost. He eventually settled in Baghdad under the protection of Saddam Hussein's regime, occasionally surfacing to give interviews, at one point even apologizing for Klinghoffer's death and claiming he had turned away from violence. The Klinghoffer family, who had fought for years to see him face a courtroom, rejected the apology entirely. Then in April 2003, Baghdad fell. U.S. Special Forces found Abbas hiding on the outskirts of the city, trying to flee toward Syria. They arrested him. After 18 years, the man who planned everything, the fruit basket, the panic, the murder, the covered-up body, the nearly catastrophic standoff between NATO allies, was finally in American custody. He died there on March 8, 2004. Heart failure, in a cell, without ever standing trial. Marilyn Klinghoffer never got to see that trial either. She died just months after the hijacking, in 1985. Some who knew her said she never truly recovered from what happened on that ship. The Achille Lauro herself sank off the coast of Somalia in 1994, caught fire, and went under. Almost like the story needed a final punctuation mark. What this hijacking left behind wasn't just grief and geopolitical wreckage. It directly created the 1988 Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against the Safety of Maritime Navigation, international law specifically built to ensure that what happened to those 97 passengers could never fall through a legal loophole again.